Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to get us started. Automated closed captioning is available for this workshop. If you click live transcription, you should get some options. Welcome to Nature-Based Solutions for Youth Physical Activity in Our Warming World. My name is Sarah Coles, and I'm the Executive Director of Texas Children in Nature Network, and we're excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session. Thank you so much for joining us. To save on bandwidth for our attendees and for a clean recording, we ask everyone to turn their cameras off and mute themselves during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat so you can share your questions there. I will share them with the presenters. Please remember to keep your comments in the chat kind. Julia Hill is running tech for us today. Thank you so much, Julia. I will share the recording in a follow-up email in a few days. If you're uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and then private message Julia with your name for our attendance. Also, if your Zoom name doesn't match the name you registered with, please change your name or let Julia know. If you're in need of a certificate and we don't have your name, we won't be able to provide that certificate. And just a reminder, if you are needing a certificate, you will need to follow the directions that were in the email you received with the Zoom link. I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Stoney people. Our ongoing colonial presence on Indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. And in just a moment, I'm going to put a few links about land acknowledgements in those people groups in the chat. And I'd like to go ahead and welcome our speaker today, Dr. Kevin Lanza with UTHealth Houston. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining today and those who join later through the recording. Yep, Kevin Lanza here, assistant professor. I'm at the Austin, Texas campus of UTHealth Houston School of Public Health. I've been here for the past almost 7 years now. And so today I'm going to share a bit on nature-based solutions for youth physical activity in our warming world. And so here we see kind of two images that will be more or less what we talk about today. We're going to first talk about or eventually talk about active transportation of youth. So how do they move with their feet or cycling or however to get from one place to another, and how could nature play a role? And on the right-hand image, we get at kind of another component of this talk, which is looking at nature play. And so playing and recreating with nature and how that can be responsive to our changing climate. So here are our main components today we'll talk through, and this is going to be more or less a 40-minute talk, and then we'll have some room for questions afterwards, but feel free to populate the chat with questions as you think of them. So first, have this introduction. This is kind of the primer, where we'll talk about the relationships between heat, physical activity, health, and well-being. And then we're going to move into some of my research projects with other participants. And these projects are all based in Austin and Houston, Texas. So hopefully that resonates with some of you. The first, we'll start with community experience with extreme heat. So this is a qualitative research project in Austin. And then we'll move into multiple projects that look at active travel and how to make that travel heat safe. And then lastly, we'll talk through a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded project with City of Austin, the Green Schoolyards Project, and how that can support children's physical activity and well-being. Okay, so starting with that baseline understanding of the relationship between climate change, heat, health, and well-being, especially of youth. Well, we know temperatures are increasing, and this is showing the temperature differences with respect to the 20th century average temperature. So across the full 20th century, it was about 57 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see from 1880 to 1940, which is like 1880 being the start of our historical climate record across the world, we see that temperatures were lower on average than the 20th century average. Yet by 1980, it's only been hotter than the 20th century average. The past decade, warmest ever recorded. So you see where things have been trending. Here, we see that not only have global average temperatures increased with time, we've also seen an increase in extreme heat events or heat waves. In the US, where these data are from, we say heat waves have increased in frequency, meaning how often they happen, heat wave duration, how long they last, heat wave season, the period as to when these events can occur, and then the intensity or how hot they are. Now, those are data from the past to present. Now, what about into the future? We're expected to see more extreme heat days under different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So here are data from Travis County, Texas, projections. We're seeing from 2020 to about 2100 under two different scenarios. The yellow line is an intermediate emission scenario, which is where we have policies in place across the world, where by the year 2040, we start stabilizing our emissions and start seeing a precipitous decline. And then we have a high emission scenario, that red line, where we just continue to pollute to levels that greenhouse gas emissions are continuing uninterrupted. And so here are the number of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 2020, about 75 days a year. But then by the end of the century, you see that wild amount of change between the greenhouse gas emission scenarios in terms of number of extreme heat days. So now, what does this have to do with human health? We see this is a framework from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Climate Change and Human Health. And in the middlemost ring, we see major climate change impacts, including rising temperatures. In the middle ring, we then see the impacts of these of climate change on different exposures. So rising temperatures lead to extreme heat exposure. And then on the outer portion, we see how these different exposures influence different health outcomes. So I've highlighted in red what I focus on in this talk and in my research, the relationship between extreme heat and health outcomes. Yet you can see that the health outcomes of interest are morbidity and mortality in relation to extreme heat. What we haven't been focusing on in research has been what does extreme heat mean for physical activity levels, as well as for mental health and well-being impacts. And so we'll learn about some of that today. Well, why have we been focusing on extreme heat in relation to health? Well, for good reason, because it leads to the most weather-related hazards, or sorry, the most deaths from weather-related hazards than any other weather-related hazard. So you can see heat here compared to these other hazards over the past 30 years, the average number of deaths per year. And now this is also grossly underreported because there isn't a standardized way of measuring heat related deaths across the over 3,000 counties in the US. And it doesn't take into account, it may miss quite a few deaths. So there has been other measures or ways of measuring heat related deaths, and it's much higher than what this has shown just from death certificates. Now, moving away from heat-related death and towards health behavior, we see that the US is also in a crisis of physical inactivity. We're not moving enough, and that's bad for our health. We see that only about half of all US adults are reaching our national physical activity guidelines for aerobic physical activity. That is about, that's accruing each week 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity or some combination of the two. Yet more alarming, only about a quarter of all youth are reaching the National Physical Activity Guidelines for aerobic physical activity, which is 60 or more minutes a day. So not only are children less active, most children are not reaching the guidelines, but there's also differences that are by race, ethnicity of children. So here are some data from UTHealth Houston, specifically the Texas School Physical Activity and Nutrition Survey, which is a statewide representative survey across Texas. And these are data from 2015, 2016. What you can see is that of the major race ethnicities in Texas, most are not reaching the National Physical Activity Guidelines among fourth graders, and Black and Latino children are less likely to reach the guidelines than those who identify as white. One reason this might be, in terms of individuals not being physically active enough in Texas, is extreme heat. Is it playing a role? Are people being too uncomfortable? Is it too uncomfortable outside thermally to go outside and engage in activity? Independent of climate change and the increases in temperature and the likelihood of extreme heat events, there's also a phenomenon called the urban heat island effect, which is where cities in places within cities are hotter than other areas because of lack of trees, high amounts of dark building materials, waste heat emissions, and the urban form or geometry. What we've seen from different science projects is that heat is inequitably distributed in cities across the US. So here, this was a community science mapping campaign done in Austin, Texas, where residents went out on their personal vehicles with these devices attached that measured air temperature and relative humidity every 1 second, along with the geographic location through a GPS unit. And then from those where they drove, we were able to estimate or model temperatures in between to get these spatially continuous maps. And you can see the hot spots. So at the same time of day, I think this is taken in the morning, you can see quite a large difference in temperature, about a 6-degree difference in temperature from the hottest places versus the coolest places. And that northwest portion of the city is a place that we focus on in our research. So this now we finished the primer on the relationship between heat, health, well-being of youth and adults. And now we're moving into that second part of this presentation where we're going to focus on heat and community experiences. So from the last slide, we did that mapping campaign of where it's hot in Texas. And now we are furthering that with this study where we focused in a region with higher urban heat island intensity, meaning that northwest portion, and we decided to explore the heat vulnerability and recommended adaptation responses of residents in that community. That community happened to be low income and majority Latino. So we recruited 18 adults in that region, shown in red up there, and most were female, 17 of the 18, most identified as Latino, and 14 of the 18 interviews, qualitative interviews, were conducted in Spanish language. So in these one-on-one interviews in person, we had this interview script, really simple. Imagine it's 105 degrees outside. What does your day look like? What do you see in your community that would make it feel cooler? And is there anything else you'd like to share? Then we did, using the community voice as the data, we then looked for recurring patterns in the data, which we then would assemble into themes, these kind of major key points across all the interviews that we wanted to share. We also looked for quotes that would attend to each of these themes. So here are the themes from those interviews. We found that heat impacted health and well-being. It was their physical health with these different symptoms, also their mental health, their physical activity level, and their social relationships. People were exposed to heat most often when they were traveling, participating in active travel, saying the bus was a big one, uh, participating in outdoor work, including construction work, and then playing outside. Heat sensitivity is the degree to which an individual is impacted by high temperatures. Every single person we interviewed mentioned children. They said that they were the most impacted by the heat and they were worried for them. Also, those with pre-existing medical conditions, including diabetes. Adaptive capacity, so that's individuals' ways of coping with high temperatures. People said they stayed home, they drank liquids, they changed their schedule to avoid the hottest times of day, and they used air conditioning, which everyone said. People mentioned there are barriers to adjusting to the temperature. There wasn't enough trees, shade in general, green spaces, but also blue spaces. Blue spaces being any types of water bodies, either artificial or natural. And then lastly, so what are some responses that we can make to our environment to protect them from the heat and make it more livable? More trees, shade structures, green spaces, blue spaces, and drinking fountains. Now I just want to share a few quotes from these community residents that get at their vulnerability to heat. Heat impacts us, especially me. I get more stressed, I get more tired. I don't feel like going for a walk to de-stress. Oops, sorry. Um, We take shelter in the house, hoping that the air will keep us cool. It hits us hard because stressed children are also locked in. Heat affects me too much because my husband comes home tired, not in the mood to play with the girls. Oh, so I can unpack that first one. I apologize. So with the first quote we see, you see how it affects them mentally and also physically. So it's stressful, it's exhausting. They don't go a walk to de-stress, so they can't even get rid of that growing stress from staying inside and being locked in, as they say, which is some pretty aggressive language. And then for that second quote, heat affects me too much because my husband comes home tired, not in the mood to play with the girls. That shows how heat has some cascading effects. So we know from this quote from this Latino woman that her husband is an outdoor construction worker. So working outside in high temperatures, comes back exhausted, and then that impacts their daughters who aren't able to play with their dad. And then you can see by heat affects me too much, it also affects the wife. I rode the bus for many years battling the heat with my girls to go to the doctor, school, and dentist. It was unbearable. So this shows that it's not only the adults that are taking the bus, it's also the children. And we got this from quite a few other community interviews. And then these are trips that they have to take, right? In terms of going to the doctor, school, and dentist. and it's not comfortable. So now let's talk just through a few more quotes, talking about barriers to staying cool in the heat, as well as some responses. Sometimes bus stops are very far away and don't have shade to look forward to. The buses were very late. If you miss one, you have to wait for the other, 30 or 40 minutes, depending on the route. So I can identify four different issues here with the bus transit system in relation to heat and health. We know that about two-thirds of people in the US walk to get to or from bus stops or stations. So it is a form of physical activity. And we know from these interviews, youth are traveling with. And so when bus stops are far away, that means that it's a prolonged exposure getting, which could be uh, related to, could lead to heat-related illness if one continues in that high heat exposure and be uncomfortable, to say the least. And then when you get to that intermediate destination, being the bus stop, there's no shade to look forward to. That's the second one. And then the buses were very late. So that means that you have continued exposure to high temperatures. And if you miss one and wait for the other, that's the headway. Only every 30 or 40 minutes, you'll get a new bus. So that's continued exposure. Second, you can't go to the river because all the people settle there. We don't even have a pool where we can go, or parks that have a splash pad or something where the kids can play. So you see here how there are different types of blue spaces that could be supporting play of children and going outside of adults. At least it's going to feel a little cooler if we have more trees and there are parks with water fountains for the children to play and all that. And let's say roofs so that it can be under a roof and not practically under the sun. So this gets at some vegetative components along with drinking water to rehydrate and then roofs. So these artificial shade structures are also considered a strategy that people appreciate. So one outcome based on what we just read there is water play amongst the different outcomes could be a potential climate solution for safe physical activity of children in the face of extreme heat. So this could be not only artificial water bodies like your pools and your splash pads and water parks, but it also could be our natural spaces and those different types of play you can have in those spaces. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot a little bit. Now we're moving to, I guess, the third part of this presentation, where we're going to talk about heat and active transportation. So I'll first start with going over some research in Austin, Texas, where we looked at the relationship between heat, different shade at at bus stops, and ridership levels of those taking the bus. And so this project happened over the full year of 29, or sorry, during the warm season of 2019. So just the summer period. And we looked at temperatures from nearby weather stations and we associated those with ridership levels of the buses across the entire transit system in Austin. What we found is that higher temperatures exhibited a negative association with ridership. So hotter outside, less people riding the bus. And we think this is because of we know most people walk to get to or from the bus stop or station, so they're probably uncomfortable to do so. So that hurts the bottom line for the transit system, and people may not be getting where they need to go because it's just too uncomfortable, it's too hot, it's too unsafe. And then we found that trees at bus stops, but not those artificial shade structures, those shelters, moderated the effect of hot days on ridership, meaning that trees had a slight protective effect against those ridership losses on extreme heat days. So this built out some opportunity for us to plant trees at bus stops as a better solution than maybe artificial shade structures. This study isn't canceling the idea of those artificial shade structures or shelters because we know that most people who ride the bus in Austin, in quite a few other cities, are lower income and they may not have an alternative mode of transportation to get to or from where they need to go. So just because there isn't ridership losses or protective effects of shelters on ridership on extreme heat days doesn't mean that we still need to protect our riders from extreme heat by either shelters or trees. Trees just may be a better option. And I hope you enjoyed this image. This is from Austin Chronicle. They covered this research and they put this in one of their pieces, which is kind of aggressive. It has a lot of fire in it. Okay, so moving on, still within Austin, I just wanted to share this kind of viral social media post by the Transit Authority. They had mentioned in 2023, look what we used to have, and now look what we have now. And so they were talking up the new bus stop shelters, the design of them, what they look like. They're sleek, they're modern, they're pretty cool looking. Yet you can imagine that this led to a lot of negative feedback from residents. They thought that, well, here's what one of them thought. They don't got enough shade. Take them back. And you can see that the top image has a large shade structure. You can see shade in the image. So the transit authority came back and said, kind of our bad as well, because we should have taken this at the same time of day where you have shade actually underneath the bottom shelter. But one reason why they did the change out was to modernize things, but also these are easier to move in case the bus stop itself was to move locations. So this then moves into another city, still focusing on bus transit systems. This led to what we call the hot stops study. That study in Austin, I got to talk with Houston Public Media, an NPR affiliate, about that study, and we actually gamed out an experiment to conduct in Houston. That led to this four-part media series called Hot Stops. It was a four-part podcast, also some written pieces. Invite you to look at that online if you'd want. But I'll now go over what we did for that project. First, I'll talk about, since we're shifting from Austin to Houston, well, who rides the public transit in Houston? In terms of buses, 55.7 million bus boardings in 2024. So one of the highest in the US. Houston's one of the largest cities in the US by population. And so looking at 2017 data, most of people who use the transit systems are using the bus. The household income is rather low. Most folks identify as African American or Hispanic Latino. If people are riding transit, they're riding it pretty often. About what, almost 75% are riding it 5 or more days a week. And then how do they access transit? This gets at one stat I mentioned earlier about how 2/3 of people walk to get to or from the bus stop or station. Well, in these data, it was 79% walk to get to the transit. So what do we do for this study? Focus in Houston, focus on 13 days, and we looked at days that were hot days, above 95 degrees in 2023. We measured uh, we measured our data during the lunch hour as well as the afternoon rush hour, and we focused on 17 bus stops with 4 different shelter designs and or tree shade. So pretty much the whole premise of the study is understanding, do are there differences in cooling by shelter designs as well as by tree shade at bus stops? And so these are the 4 that we focus on in Houston, although there are 22 different shelter designs in the transit system for buses in Houston. So numbers 2 and 4 are the vast majority of the designs that are in the Houston transit system. These are shown, they have these canopies, they have these 3 walls that have these plastic acrylic transparent panels, and they're enclosed structures, we'll call them. And then on the bottom, these 2 others, type number 12 and type number 13, make up a very small percentage of all the bus stop shelters in the Houston transit. I think around 5% or less. And so these are a very different types of design, right? They're open air, they're not enclosed as much by walls on the side, and they have different types of shading and different materials. So what we did is we measured a advanced heat stress metric. So air temperature is a heat stress metric. Heat index is a combination of air temperature, relative humidity. What we measured was what we call wet bulb globe temperature. This includes 4 different weather elements: air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and radiation. So that energy that hits you when you're in the sun, that's that radiation. And so it's important to take into account when we look at things like shading. We measured wet bulb globe temperature through 2 different devices, Quest Temp 15 and X-Tech HT 200. These are both wet bulb globe temperature measuring devices. We actually put them on tripods so they would mimic the height of an individual more or less sitting. And you can see that in some of these images here. And what we did is we measured at 4 locations, if those locations were there. And we took 3 measurements per location per stop. So those 4 locations, we always measured in direct sunlight because that was for comparison to the tree shade and the shelters, as well as the shade cast by shelter. So those are the 3 locations we compared to direct sunlight. And then statistical analysis, we ran these regression models to show what is the association between the shelter or the tree shade or the shade cast by shelter on wet bulb globe temperature. So without further ado, what we found is that trees were more effective at cooling than shelters. and cooling from shelters differed by the design type. And so remember, this is wet bulb globe temperature, not air temperature. So these are pretty aggressive numbers, actually. So tree canopy was about 5.7 degrees Fahrenheit wet bulb globe temperature cooler than being in it unshaded outside of the tree shade. Yet when you look at the shelters, you see the least cooling are the enclosed shelter designs, where the shelter type number two isn't even statistically significant, the cooling. So we actually would say there's no real association between cooling and that shelter design compared to being unshaded outside the shelter. However, you see that the open air designs are more cooling than the enclosed designs, but aren't as good at cooling as the tree canopy. So we think the differences between the enclosed, the top two designs, versus the open air designs, the bottom two, is that the bottom two allow for wind to pass through. And remember, that's one of the components of WBGT, that wet bulb globe temperature. And then the top ones, the enclosed designs, also trap that energy. So once the sun and the radiation gets underneath or inside the shelter, it isn't able to escape back out into space as readily. We also found that shade cast by shelter was actually cooler, uh, was providing more cooling than several of the shelter designs. And that's because you don't have those enclosed structures impeding the wind speed. One interesting finding we found is that when it was based on time of day, unshaded underneath a shelter, and this was only happened to be the case for shelter type number four based on when we collected data, it was actually hotter underneath the unshaded shelter than if someone was standing outside in direct sunlight. So it was about 6 degrees hotter. This is what we call maladaptation, where you have a opportunity to provide some support through a strategy, yet it leads to a negative consequence, unfortunately. And people already knew this. So here's a quote someone said in Spanish: "We look for shade nearby. We don't go inside the bus shelter because it feels steamy in there." So what do we recommend from these findings? Well, it's siting stops near trees. So bus stops themselves, they can be moved in terms of, but it takes some time and some planning as to where to place a bus stop. But it also takes even more time to raise a tree, as we know. You don't just plant a full mature tree when you want a tree somewhere. So let's take advantage of our existing forest, and then at the same time, let's seed our next generation of trees, plant trees at bus stops. Furthermore, it's not only about the intermediate destination, the bus stop, it's also about how you get to and from those spaces. So let's plant trees along those routes. Okay, so sticking with the heat and active transportation, just moving on to briefly talk about an ongoing study that we're doing in Austin. This is just a screenshot from a county in Florida, but pretty much children, we're trying to incentivize walking or cycling to get to and from school, so active commuting. Uh, Active commuting has been encouraged through Safe Routes to School programs nationally in the US, which is trying to increase the proportion of children who are walking or cycling to and from school through transformative infrastructure changes and different policies. Yet the safe routes definition is mostly about traffic injury and reducing the likelihood of that. But I don't think it has been incorporating ambient environmental exposures, including air temperature and heat. And so that's what I'm looking at currently. And so one way I'm looking at that is I'm modeling tree planting initiatives and seeing what plantings might mean on routes to and from school in terms of what they would mean for cooling the nearby environment. And so there's this other heat stress metric called Universal Thermal Climate Index. Just like wet bulb global temperature, it's an advanced heat stress metric. And so what we are doing is we're first measuring what are the possible active travel routes to and from school. So that includes bike lanes, sidewalks, roads for cycling. And that's what you can see in the hashed black portions of these three images, the potential active travel routes to and from school. And then the green triangles are where there's proposed tree plantings, and these are placed by a model based on where it would be most effective at providing cooling. And so you can see on the bottom two images, what is that heat stress before tree planting versus after, where the red is hot and the blue is cooler. And remember, this is UTCI, which is a different measure than temperature. And I'm also showcasing Celsius here, not Fahrenheit. So pretty much what you can do is if you look at where trees are being planted, those green triangles, and you look at that bottom right image, you can see that there is some blue or cooling added by those trees compared to the left-hand image. what is kind of fascinating is it's hyper localized. Just because you plant a tree, it's not going to be cooling an area that's many feet or meters away from that tree. It's really where the tree specifically is that provides that shading and that cooling. Okay, so that was heat and active transportation. Now I'm shifting to the last part of our talk, which is looking at uh, green schoolyards as a potential intervention for heat and to promote safe physical activity of children. And so what you can see in this image are some photos we took at the schools in 2019 when this project was being conducted. And you can see children, you can see some type of school park, you can see children under the shade. What you can't see is it was over 100 degrees when this was taken in September. So the aims of this project were to determine how these trees, gardens, nature trails at these elementary school parks impacted the temperatures within the parks, the physical activity levels of Latino children from low-income households, and then how these children's psychological connection to nature are related to their social emotional learning skills. These SEL skills are the skills we need in our lives in order to thrive, whether that be in the workplace, at home, or out and about. The project took place in Austin at 3 elementary schools, all of which had over 85% economically disadvantaged Latino households. We focus on 2 weeks of September and 1 week in November because, for comparison purposes, a historically higher temperature period of the school year and a more mild temperature period. And then we tasked about 213 children in third and fourth grade, so ages about 8 to 11, with wearing accelerometers and GPS devices during their 20-minute on average recess periods. This allowed us to know their physical activity levels in time and space during their recess. We measured green features, those trees and the shade structures, using aerial imagery within GIS, or Geographic Information System. And we measured temperature and relative humidity by installing different sensors per school park, about 10 sensors per park. And we placed these sensors to have equal distribution across the park and to capture different land covers, such as soil versus grass versus pavement, as well as different land uses, so like basketball courts, playgrounds, running tracks, soccer fields. We measured children's psychological connection to nature through this instrument called the Connection to Nature Index. It has 16 different questions. Here's an example question. When I feel sad, I like to go outside and enjoy nature. They were all on 5-point Likert scales. And then to get that single connection to nature index score, you average the scores across the 16 questions for every student. Then we measured children's SEL skills by an annual survey that the district was already offering. So there were 10 items that got at SEL skills. And so here's one of those example items. Never a little, or I use ways to calm myself down, never a little time, sometimes a lot of the time. You can see on the right-hand side the different categories of SEL that we focused on. So here are some of the findings from the Green Square Arts project. We found that heat index, which is that combination term for air temperature and relative humidity, differed across sites within parks. So the red is the hottest spot in the park, heat index of 114 degrees Fahrenheit. That's characterized by that top right image, an unshaded playground. Yet just about 50 meters south of that was the coolest spot in the park, which is that black polygon. And that is a shaded playground, and it reached about 103 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's that bottom right image. From having those 213 children wear those accelerometers, GPS devices, and having the temperature sensors outside and measuring green space, we were able to showcase that as temperatures rise, children decrease their physical activity and they seek shade. At 91 degrees Fahrenheit on this image, it shows you when it's the inflection point. It's when children spent a larger percentage of time during recess under the shade and not engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity. We also found, not shown in this image, that children in the park with the most, uh, what's it called? The most tree canopy, we found that children engage in more physical activity, about 6% more than the other parks. And lastly, we found that children's psychological connection to nature had a significant positive association with their overall SEL skills, their self-awareness, their self-management, and their relationship skills. From the Green Square Arts Project, we can offer a few recommendations based on our evidence. Uh, the first group is environmental interventions, and the second grouping is policy or programmatic interventions. So in schoolyard design, you can green the schoolyards. We found that that is associated with higher levels of physical activity. Greening provides some shade and cooler temperatures. It's not only adding shaded for places intended for physical activity, but also those intended for rest, because we don't expect people to be active 100% of the time they're outside. You need to take breaks, especially in high temperatures. And people who are watching children, just caregivers, should also have a space to feel comfortable. In terms of policies, one could schedule recess during more comfortable times of day, but also taking into account the context of school time, where recesses are meant to be not only physical breaks, but mental breaks, both for teachers and children. And so typically having it be the first offering in the day may not be reasonable, even if the temperatures are cooler. I think the answer here is just not making sure it's not at the hottest time of the day. You can organize shaded play. So on days when it's really hot, you could find the shaded part of the schoolyard if you so have it and activate it through maybe a frisbee game or some other type of programming. And then there's this idea, why not just shift recess inside? Well, we know in schools that inside space is pretty heavily used, and so it may be used for other offerings at the time. And also, we spend more than 90% of our time indoors. So we know that connecting with nature, that's mostly happening outside. So let's get out there if we can. Okay, now I'm going to show some sneak peeks into some current ongoing research. So there's this hypothesis called the struct, and so we just focus on the past slides on during the school year. But I guess one overarching question is that's not when it's the hottest time of year, right? It's not the summer, it's not the warm season. So what about that summertime? There's this hypothesis called the structured days hypothesis, which shows that children engage in more obesogenic behaviors during the summer versus during the school year. And the hypothesis thinks it's because there's less structure during the summertime. So during the school day, people wake up, they follow a routine, they go to school, they do have certain activities, they go home, there's a schedule. But during the summer, that schedule shifts wildly and may even have different schedules even during the same summer. So children are more likely to engage in these obesogenic behaviors, meaning higher what is it, lower levels of physical activity during the summer, higher levels of screen time, and a worse diet. So our interest is on understanding, could heat play a role in children engaging in less physical activity and engaging in higher amounts of screen time during the summer? So from 26 children a couple summers ago wearing those accelerometers and GPS devices for 7 continuous days, we found that during the summer, as temperatures rise, children spend less time engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity and more time being sedentary. This could seem like duh research, and I think a lot of it is, but it is important to identify this through our best measures in terms of what's the issue, heat on physical activity during the summer, and now we can work with those data to figure out some solutions. Not only, so this work so far has been looking at children around third to fourth grade, so ages 8 to 11. But what about younger children, so preschool age children? Does temperature have an impact on them outside of the school setting and outside of summertime, but instead in childcare settings? So in one of our other projects, we found that yes, on hot days, preschoolers are less active when they're in their outdoor play areas. So you can see here, the left-hand side, they are spending more time in sedentary behaviors, so sitting, not moving, when they're outside in their outdoor play areas at their child care center. But at the same time, they're spending less time engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So they're just sitting around, not being as active. So based on what we've shared today, just want to kind of summarize our talk. While average temperatures are increasing across the world due to climate change, there's also another phenomenon increasing temperatures, and that's that urban heat island effect. So these are layered on top of each other. Extreme heat impacts multiple health and health-related outcomes. Everyone's affected by heat, but certain populations, especially low-income households, unfairly experience a greater burden. And I showed that through that urban heat island intensity being higher in that economically disadvantaged Latino neighborhood in Austin that we did those community interviews with. They lower income folks also have less resources available to them. Maybe it's like working air conditioning or ability to pay the bills. They have higher energy burden, and so um, they feel the heat more in terms of what it means for their pocketbook, but also for their livelihoods. And then lastly, there are some nature-based strategies that could be green space, that could be blue space, that can promote safe physical activity to our youth in the face of extreme heat. kind of want to end with this quote, this slogan from the South African disability rights movement of the 1990s. I think it also resonates with some climate justice work, which is nothing about us without us is for us, in that we truly need to include those that are facing unfair climate impacts in designing solutions for those solutions to be truly effective. And I'd like to thank all the folks that have worked with me on these different projects. This is a slew of folks from different backgrounds and different sectors, academia, UTHealth Houston, UT Austin, as well as media reporters, nonprofit organizations. Much appreciated. And thank you all for listening today. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have either now or if you think of them later or want to reach out about potential collaborations, please feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I have a question to get us started, and as folks, if you have questions, I will read them as well. Um, I know you showed the picture of the playground and the shaded area on the school grounds. Licensing for playgrounds for schools requires that there can't be any trees within 6 feet of a playground structure. And so kind of what sorts of things have you seen that have been effective in terms of trying to find that shade for those playground structures?
Gosh. Well, that's disheartening to learn that there's a policy in place that's um, withholding this potential effective solution, or what we've shown as an effective solution to moderate temperatures, being tree shade. Um, let's talk more about that. I want to find ways to short circuit some of these policies that are maybe doing more harm than good, even if they were created in a comfortable or with best conscious in mind. I think that artificial shade structures also provide good shade, and I've seen, at least in Central Texas, a lot of our playgrounds have those artificial shade canopies, right? Those shade sails, and they do a pretty good job, and they're at a height that probably allows for them to be there rather than those trees. But then you could argue if the trees are a bit lower and they're healthy and we are caring of them, then perhaps they also provide some nature play opportunities. So I think it's needing to have those conversations to move our evidence to action. So we have the evidence, meaning trees are cooling. They do so better than a lot of our artificial structures. Now, who do we need to showcase these data to? And then what other types of information do they need to move this into positively disrupting our current status quo? Because we know that right now, in lots of ways, our status quo is not working.
Great, thank you. I do know those same requirements don't exist for nature play. So things like stumps and logs don't have to have that same requirement. Um, our first question is from Renee. Do you find that the findings supporting any meaningful change based on the recommendations? If not, what, if anything, could you say about the next steps, recommendations for those of us working in the space?
Next steps for recommendations. One thing I'm working towards, there's several times of or types of potential interventions to promote safe physical activity of children in the face of extreme heat. There's those environmental ones like the tree plantings, the shade structures, the access and construction of uh, blue spaces. And so I think one is, can we get these physical elements in our environment? Two, can we provide physical access to these spaces? Can people get to them and use them? For instance, I know I've learned that in Austin, the school district, actually, every single school, you should be able to, that's a public school, you should be able to access outside of school hours. Their park space. Yet some of these schools are still locking or preventing people from using it just by putting a lock on the door, or people don't know that they can even use it. So I think is the physical piece there. Is it usable and accessible? Do people know it's usable or accessible? But then these are all environmental intervention related. The other one is programming. Can we provide the right programming in place to activate these spaces? I think is also important in terms of policies. I'd be happy to kind of further that question or further my response if I didn't answer the question fully, just let me know.
Well, I mainly just wondered, that's good information to know too. I was just wondering with all of what you were showing with the bus stops and the trees and everything. Do you feel like, I mean, we're in an environment right now where maybe there are more challenges than there had been with some of this work. So I was just wondering, are you finding barriers to implementing the changes based on your recommendations? Or are people starting to really create more, tree cover around bus stops and on bus routes? I mean, what do you see right now?
Okay, good. And I'm happy you brought up that last component about the buses because I can tell you some very real-time updates with the buses. So in Houston, with working with the transit authority there, or working initially with the investigative reporters, it kind of was closer to a contentious relationship with the transit authority, and for good reason in certain ways. Because what happened is we kind of called them out that the shelters could actually lead to higher temperatures than if there was no shelter there and there weren't enough trees around their bus stops. And so this got quite a bit of a media attention. And we've been talking and working with the transit authority, and they have been actively prototyping new types of shelter designs that are more supportive of moderating heat stress. They're now, some of them have been installed in the environment and they're collecting data on them. We're still actively working or communicating with them about what tree planting could look like at bus stops. That involves quite a few different players. So you have to have thumbs up from the transit authority to have a tree at its bus stop. You have to have thumbs up from the city that that space can be allocated for a tree. You then have to have the trees themselves, which can come from a nonprofit local tree planting organization. And then lastly, you need to have someone maintain those trees. And so all those things have to kind of align, but you can see how it evolves multiple sectors. And so how do you get all these people in the same room? We have a grant proposal under review to s- strategically go through collecting more data and doing so with adolescents as a environmental literacy type program that then ultimately leads into building out a case for where to plant trees in different neighborhoods in Houston along their bus stops, and then we're going to hopefully actually get those in the ground. So we'll see if that gets funded. So it's a continuing conversation, but we need to get dollars behind it. I haven't had as much back and forth yet about the tree planting and the shade structures for physical activity of children in school settings. These are conversation. I know they're already actively doing these things, but I'm learning things every day, such as I learned from Sarah how there's not there's that stipulation for trees but unless they're nature play areas. So that might be the saving grace.
So our next question is, does the type of tree matter?
Yes. Um, there, I will say this, it's easy to say that's understudied in terms of which tree is the right tree. I do have a study from 2016 that looked at what trees are suitable for urban heat management in terms of climate change is leading to increasing temperatures and leading to a shifting of hardiness zones northward. So hardiness zones are those average annual minimum temperatures in which a tree can thrive and grow. And so we're seeing that species that used to be adapted for a region are now shifting where they're only adapted to northward regions because they're cooler there because temperatures are increasing. But and that's at the species level across maybe 20 or so cities. But we haven't done enough research on specific tree species and their different benefits, right? That would be both as biodiversity, but also carbon sequestration in terms of mitigating climate change. It would also be about leaf cover. So think about a deciduous versus a coniferous tree and what that might mean for shade amount, but also for leaf drop. One thing that's neat about trees is that they naturally, deciduous ones drop, a lot of them drop their leaves during the winter when you actually want more of that sun exposure, right? Because it's cold. So you want to actually have more energy, radiant energy hitting you. So that the jury's still out on specific trees, but I do think we're leaning into native species, climate smart species, and thinking about our future climate, not our present climate.
Great. With that in mind, I put in the chat, when we're talking to schools about green schoolyards and tree planting, we're recommending them looking at tree species from about 50 to 100 miles south of where they currently are, in order to have more longevity for those trees. which becomes a challenge when you're working on the border. Um, because there's no US tree suppliers south of where they are. Um, but our next question is from Kayla. Curious if you have any thoughts about the systems that intersect for tree planting. In Austin, there's a push to plant trees along sidewalks and walkways, but who are the responsible party for watering the trees and to ensure that they don't die is pushed around and delays trees getting planted. Seems like the systems, city departments make it harder to implement the change.
Yeah. I mean, that gets to the many pieces of this is what we call a wicked problem, right? There's like not one right answer because by doing one thing, you limit other things. So just as how everything above ground is accounted for in terms of zoning and who has kind of ownership of that space, same with below ground. And so that's where trees get really tricky, right? Thinking about their root system and what that means for different piping, et cetera. So you have to have everyone at the table. Do we have classic settings that allow for that? I don't think so. And so we have to make that a priority. And I think one way to do that is not only creating this evidence, but then it's within our projects and programming. We need to think about having the right people in the room. And so I don't have a good answer for you there in terms of, yeah, there's a lot of stipulations. I know that the municipal code in Austin, at least I believe, is that spacing of trees is supposed to be every 22 feet in terms of street trees. And I think that's for so canopy doesn't have intensive overlap and allows for the tree root systems to grow properly. It might be for other reasons as well. So it's just piecing together all those different policies for a given space and knowing that different zoning types as well and ownerships will have also different things. In terms of who maintains the trees, that's the stickiest problem because trees themselves in planting them, that's not where the cost is as much. I mean, there is a cost there, but I suspect you'd have a lot of people even donating that time and that effort. I think it's more about who's gonna finish the follow through, and does that fit within our representatives' election cycles? Does that fit within people working in those positions in terms of turnover? So you may work with a strong advocate who may no longer be there by the time you need to continue to maintain those trees. So you have to have a sustainable system that has legs to it.
Great. Our next question is from Kathy. Where we cite bodies of water to account for prevailing breeze, cooling adjacent to open spaces is another strategy missing in our urban environments. There are also interventions that can help direct scoop air, etc. Thermal mass is important, and we tend to design a lot of structures that also radiate heat, not just trap it. That might be a comment and not a question, but any thoughts on the comment?
It's a good one. Hi, Kathy. Good to see you here. I've met you before. Yeah, you obviously have your pulse on a lot of these different innovative strategies, and it's about making systems changes. I get nervous when we make incremental changes that are actually bringing us backwards in a way. So I'll just give an anecdote. So if I ever see a new um, on-road bike lane, I get a bit sad because I'm thinking, well, what we really need in terms of reducing traffic injury and even distance from cars for pollution is a separated bike lane in terms of physically different than where cars are driving. And so when you see like a band-aid approach to things, it's kind of an eye roll, but also just like depressing. So we do need to think, how do we get transformative and have the changes that matter? I think it's creating evidence. It's putting it in front of the people that need to see that evidence. And it's needing to have quite a few stepping stones in mind, knowing that that initial piece of evidence is just the start of that story. And we have to keep going and have that persistence with our ideas. Any change takes over 10 years.
And our next question is also from Kathy. Is anyone in your research team looking at vining vegetation in lieu of trees? They grow quickly and require less water.
Yep. Not from my research team per se, but from other research teams I've seen, and I've seen that as a peddled idea for implementation. Typically, they'll have like a shelter, like an artificial structure that has some types of like kind of grid on it that allows for the twisting and vines to grow. Those those can work. I think you think about a few things there. You think about aesthetics when they die. You think about maintenance in terms of clippings and such. Um, they don't offer the same types of benefits as a tree would. I'm not canceling the idea. I think it's more of I'd like to see trees planted early, like as in yesterday, and allowing them to grow while you have these intermediate investments that are shorter term investments in tandem, such as vining. So let's have a tree, let's plant it, let's throw some vines up of the current structure and allow that to kind of take place.
Helps if I unmute myself.
Sure.
That is the last of our questions. Thank you so much, Kevin. I am putting oh, Elizabeth. Yes, please.
I didn't type it out. Hey, Kevin.
Hey.
Elizabeth here from EcoRise. I'm curious, I had the same question about, your data clearly pointing towards more municipal tree canopies. Your data also points towards more outdoor programming, perhaps for kids. I I don't want to make that assumption. Would you agree with that statement that there's a need for additional outdoor programming?
Uh, yes, I mean we need to get kids out there and active and safe. I think the I think there's a big inequities in programming. So if you pay a certain amount, you can get into certain types of programming that might have advanced outcomes. There are other, um, and then how do we provide access, cultural access, financial access to these different types of programming? There's out of school programs during the school year. There's out of school programs outside of the school year in terms of summertime efforts. I'm really concerned about that summertime because of the high participation in those obesogenic behaviors and the less structure in those times of year. You can see these summer camps pay to play for a lot of them. You also see that there are awesome people out there that have created organizations that minimize that cost in lots of ways. So let's keep that energy there. Let's provide some data to back up why we have these spaces, and let's like shout from the hilltops that these things exist. I think is the answer.
Yeah, I think, specifically about like if we're thinking about the urban tree planting, you think about the Department of Urban Forestry at the City of Austin. And like when I think about programming for kids over the summer, like obviously there's fantastic programming through PARD, and they're limited in terms of what they can provide. I, know from personal experience that they're like super competitive to get kids, signed up quickly. And so, of course, that, lends itself towards people who have those additional resources to be able to grab those spots. So, yeah, it's tricky, and it feels like, yeah, we should be seeing a big push. Those seem like the two obvious policy consequences to come out of your work, is more tree planting in an urban setting, and then care for those trees to be established and healthy, and then additional programming for students to engage in the outdoors in a way that you know allows them to continue to be active regardless of the season.
I think you nailed it. Thanks for summarizing everything. The only additions would be, I think not that my research has shown this, but I've kind of alluded to it, is the water play, because that's a natural way to cool someone while they're being active. I also need to be aware of, recency right now with the flooding events that have happened and the heartbreaking events or, outcomes of those. And so I think we need to be just very careful with our water sources, but at the same time, we need to clean them and we need to activate them during a lot of times of the year in terms of play and what that could mean in terms of nature connectedness. So that's going to be a tricky one that I want to work with colleagues.
Yeah, I'm only aware of this because of personal experience, but there are some interesting things happening where there's an AISD school that has a partnership with the YMCA East Communities, and they take all of the kindergarteners to go do the Collins Hope program. And so they all do water safety and, water access, and that's free, and that's at a Title I school in AISD. So like those kinds of things are possible, but how do we get them to happen at scale?
Oh my goodness. Well, let's keep talking a little bit. Thank you.
I think that's something that coastal communities tend to do a little bit more. I know when I was in Corpus Christi ISD, being able to swim by the time you were in fourth grade was a requirement to move past fourth grade. You had to take swimming, and I think it's because it is a coastal community. They think about that a lot more than some more inland ISDs.
You nailed it. And like, I think water literacy, swim literacy is relatively low. I'm from Florida, where I think you learn how to swim before walking. And I wish other folks had that joy of just seeing that, most of the world is water, and I'd hope we'd be able to access that. But there are a lot of historical reasons why people have been excluded from these opportunities. So. Well, and I guess the last thing I'll mention is that there's another thing I'm working on. It's called heat acclimatization. So it is just like with altitude, or if you're in Colorado, for instance, you need to get used to that, your body. But you can do the same thing with heat. So it's that gradual exposure to high temperatures alongside certain levels of physical activity over like a 10 to 14-day period. You can actually physiologically, your body, along with psychologically, get more comfortable in higher temperatures. I'm trying to build that in or test for initial summertime periods. Let's get kids more used to and safer with those temperatures so they can literally feel better psychologically and physically later in the summer. And so we'll see how that turns out. It's pretty contentious because the idea of getting kids used to high temperatures is not everyone likes that wording.
I wonder, because immediately my thought was like, well, yeah, I worked summer camp. By the time you get to the end of the summer, it's like, it's fine. Um, and so I wonder if some of the like Austin Sunshine camps and Camp El Ranchito might be good partners for that because they are outside all summer long.
We're actually actively piloting now. We have a really small sample, though. That's an issue, but we're testing out this intervention of following a heat acclimatization schedule with children ages like around fourth grade and seeing what that might mean for their physical activity down the road during the summer. I think the main thing is funding. We just need to build out the projects we need to do to get a statistically powerful sample that could lead to actual strong evidence requires quite a bit of resources, and we need to find a funder that would be interested in it. And we
Mhm.
need to write the thing to make it interesting.
Well, great. We are at time. So thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, the evaluations in the chat. Also, our next workshop webinar is, let me find the name here, is Nature Matters, the Importance of Outdoor Play and Child Development. So would love to see you at that workshop. And thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.